Students of World War II and the Nazis' attempted extermination of the Jews during the war are very aware of the crimes committed against humanity in the name of racial purity. Those sworn to protect life soon became those who extinguished it. The intoxication created due to the power over life and death brought during this period seemed to permeate the minds of so-called men of science. This is the story of one man who became the most famous of those ideologues, following the orders of an insane dictator in a successful propaganda campaign to utilize expendable human beings for the most barbaric experiments in the name of advancing human knowledge.
Spring 1945. Allied armies under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower defeated the forces of Nazi Germany after a hard-fought campaign. Europe finally broke free from the 6 years under the knife of the Third Reich. It was one thing for the Allied forces to have defeated one of the most tyrannical regimes in history. It was another to see the destruction firsthand. As armies marched through once German-occupied territory, they came across the concentration camps of rumor and innuendo, discovering that the Nazis came close to reaching their objective of total racial purity. As the Allies went through the camps in an effort to assess the number of dead, sick, or those barely hanging on, they became aware of the chamber of horrors that existed at the camps. It is then that they drew the distinction between concentration camps and death camps, those built for the sole purpose of the extermination of a whole race of people. After the liberation of the camps, the Allies realized that these crimes against humanity must not occur again and formulated a court at Nuremberg, Germany, where the first war criminals had been tried for crimes against humanity and forcing total war on society. Most of the men and women who perpetrated these crimes were captured, placed on trial, and then executed or given long prison sentences, depending on the severity of their offenses. With the concentration on those who declared war on the human race, some slipped through the dragnet. One of the most famous and prolific purveyors of human destruction escaped human justice only to meet with his maker in another realm. This man's name, Dr. Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, near Ulm, Germany. He was the eldest son of Karl Mengele, a prosperous manufacturer of farming implements. In 1935, Mengele earned a Ph.D. in physical anthropology from the University of Munich. In January 1937, he became the assistant of Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer at the Institute of Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. Like most educated individuals in Germany at the time, Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937. He then received his medical degree in 1938, the same year he joined the Schutzstaffel, the SS. Mengele was drafted into the army in June 1940 and subsequently volunteered for the medical service of the Waffen-SS, the Armed SS. While on the Eastern Front, Mengele received wounds that deemed him unfit for combat, and so he returned to Germany in January 1943. He began work at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics, directed by his former mentor, von Verschuer. With the uprisings and shutdown in the Treblinka and Sobibor camps, and with the increased tempo of the killing across the East, Auschwitz soon saw a surge in medical experimentation. Josef Mengele soon found a home at Auschwitz. His uniform was always pressed and neat, and he always seemed to have a faint smile on his face. In April of 1943, he received a promotion to the rank of SS captain. This promotion shortly preceded Mengele's transfer to Auschwitz on May 30th, 1943. During his time at Auschwitz, Josef Mengele was not the only physician there. It is popularly believed that he was one of the highest-ranking physicians at the camp. This was not the case. That distinction belonged to SS Captain Dr. Edward Wirth's. Wirth's position as garrison physician made him responsible in all medical matters for the entire camp complex. Mengele began his career at Auschwitz in the spring of 1943 as the medical officer responsible for Birkenau's Gypsy camp. Several weeks after its liquidation, in November 1943, Mengele undertook a new position as chief camp physician of Auschwitz II, Birkenau. He was still under Wirth's jurisdiction. Approximately 30 physicians served at Auschwitz while Mengele was assigned to the camp. As a required part of their rounds, medical staff performed selections of prisoners on the ramp. These selections determined who, from among the mass of humanity arriving at Auschwitz, could be retained for work and who would perish immediately in the gas chambers. Every doctor in his part of the camp took their turn as the selection officer, and many found the work depressing. Josef Mengele adored it, and he was always willing to take other doctors' shifts on the arrival ramp. In the normal course of his work, he managed an infirmary where the sick were executed, assisted other doctors with their work, supervised inmate medical staff, and conducted his own research among the thousands of inmates he personally selected for human experiment programs he also started and managed. The experiments Mengele devised were ghoulish beyond belief, motivated and energized by the seemingly bottomless pool of condemned human beings placed at his disposal. Mengele continued the work he had started at Frankfurt by studying the influence of heredity on various physical traits. Identical twins were useful for this kind of genetics research because they, of course, have identical genes. Any differences between them, therefore, must be the result of environmental factors. This makes sets of twins perfect for isolating genetic factors by comparing and contrasting their bodies and behavior. Once he orchestrated an unending stream of test subjects, Mengele assembled hundreds of pairs of twins and sometimes spent hours measuring various parts of their bodies and taking careful notes. Mengele often injected one twin with mysterious substances and monitored the illness that ensued. He applied painful clamps to children's limbs to induce gangrene, injected dyes into their eyes, which were then shipped back to a pathology lab in Germany, and gave them spinal taps. When the test subject died, the child's twin would be immediately injected with chloroform into the heart, and then both would be dissected for comparison. On one occasion, Josef Mengele killed 14 pairs of twins this way and spent a sleepless night performing autopsies on his victims. For all of his methodical work habits, Mengele could be impulsive. During one selection, between work and death, on the arrival platform, a middle-aged woman had been selected for work who refused to be separated from her 14-year-old daughter who had been assigned death. A guard who tried to pry them apart got a nasty scratch on the face and had to fall back. Mengele stepped in to resolve the matter by shooting both the girl and the mother, and then he cut short the selection and sent everybody to the gas chamber. On another occasion, the Birkenau doctors argued whether a boy they had all grown fond of had tuberculosis. Mengele left the room and came back an hour or two later, apologizing for the argument and admitting he had been wrong. During his absence, he shot the boy and dissected him for signs of the disease, which he hadn't found. In 1944, Mengele's zest and enthusiasm for his work did not go unnoticed by his superiors, and they promoted Mengele to a management position within the camp. In this capacity, he was responsible for public health measures at the camp, in addition to his own research at Birkenau. Again, his impulsive streak surfaced when he made decisions for the tens of thousands of inmates. This promotion gave Mengele more control over more inmates coming into the camp and more control of the selections. When typhus broke out among the women's barracks, for example, Mengele solved the problem in his characteristic way. He ordered one block of 600 women gassed and their barracks fumigated. Then he moved the next block of women over and fumigated their barracks. This was repeated for each woman's block until the last one was clean and ready for a new shipment of workers. He did it again a few months later during a scarlet fever outbreak. Through it all, Mengele's research continued. In the pointless effort to prove crackpot Nazi race theories, Mengele stitched pairs of twins together at the back, gouged out the eyes of people with different colored irises, and vivisected children who knew him as kindly old Uncle Pappy. When a form of gangrene called Noma broke out in the Gypsy camp, Mengele's absurd focus on race led him to investigate the genetic causes he was sure were behind the epidemic. To study this, he sawed off the hands of infected prisoners and sent the preserved samples to Germany for study. After the glut of Hungarian prisoners were mostly killed off during the summer of 1944, the transports of new prisoners slowed down and eventually stopped. Operations at the camp were wound down through the fall and into the winter. In January 1945, the camp complex at Auschwitz was mostly dismantled and the starving prisoners forced marched to, of all places, Dresden, which was about to be bombed mercilessly by the Allies. Dr. Josef Mengele packed up his research notes and specimens, dropped them off with a trusted friend, and headed west to avoid capture by the Red Army. Mengele managed to avoid the victorious Allies until June, when he was picked up by an American patrol. He was traveling under his own name at the time, but the wanted criminal list hadn't been efficiently distributed, and the Americans let him go. By this time, an organization known as Odessa tasked itself with assisting Nazi war criminals to leave Germany and the Allies' jurisdiction. Mengele spent some time working as a farmhand before deciding to avail himself of Odessa's services, leaving the country in 1949. No doubt his family's fortune contributed to Mengele's ability to travel extensively and escape awaiting justice. Using a variety of aliases and sometimes his own name again, Mengele managed to avoid capture for decades. It helped that almost nobody was looking for him and that the governments of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay were all highly sympathetic to the escaping Nazis who sought refuge there. Even in exile, and with the world to lose if he got caught, Mengele couldn't behave himself. In the 1950s, he opened an unlicensed medical practice in Buenos Aires, where he specialized in performing illegal abortions. This actually got him arrested when one of his patients died. But according to one witness, a friend of his showed up in court with a bulging envelope full of cash for the judge, who subsequently dismissed the case. In 1959, Mengele traveled to Paraguay to treat the former secretary to the Fuhrer, Martin Bormann, who had been sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg and who was now dying of stomach cancer. In 1956, the West German government issued identity papers for Josef Mengele under his own name and allowed his family to leave the country unobserved to visit him in South America. Israeli efforts to capture him were diverted, first by the chance to capture SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, then by the looming threat of war with Egypt, which drew the Mossad's attention away from the fugitive Nazis for good. It appeared obvious that Mengele enjoyed endless freedom without any law enforcement authority concentrating on his capture. But one man, a concentration camp survivor, formed an organization to hunt down the Nazi war criminals. Simon Wiesenthal made it his life's mission to make sure that anyone responsible or who may have knowingly participated in the Holocaust would meet with the proper justice. Wiesenthal concentrated on those such as Mengele and provided information as to the Angel of Death's locations over the years. Greece in 1960, Cairo in 1961, Spain in 1971, and Paraguay in 1978. It appeared that Wiesenthal's pleas went unanswered. to demonstrate to the world that Mengele truly conducted the experiments witnessed by his surviving victims. A court in Israel held a trial in which witnesses and evidence had been introduced. Wiesenthal sat as one of the justices during the mock trial. Of course, the verdict was of no mystery. Of the children involved, only about 200 remained alive when the camp was liberated by the Soviet Army on January 27, 1945. These are the children shown so often in documentaries walking between the wires of Auschwitz I. Today they reside all over the world, and they seek information on what was done to them. Their files have never been located, and what was done to them remains a mystery.
When West Germany offered a reward for his capture, it prompted Mengele to flee. Former pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel put him in touch with Nazi supporter Wolfgang Gerhardt, who helped Mengele to cross the border into Brazil. He stayed with Gerhardt on his farm near Sao Paulo until more permanent accommodation could be found, with Hungarian expatriates Geza and Gita Stammer. The couple bought a farm in Nova Europa with the help of an investment from Mengele, who was given the job of managing the farm for them. The three bought a coffee and cattle farm in Serra Negra in 1962, with Mengele owning a half interest. Gerhardt had initially told the Stammers that the fugitive's name was Peter Hochbichler, but they discovered his true identity in 1963. Gerhardt persuaded the couple not to report Mengele's location to the authorities by convincing them that they themselves could be implicated for harboring a fugitive. In February 1961, West Germany widened its extradition request to include Brazil, having been tipped off to the possibility that Mengele had relocated there. Allegedly, Mengele died of a stroke in 1977 while swimming under the name of Gerhardt. Mossad director Isser Harel hoped to locate Mengele and bring him to be tried in Israel as he had done with Adolf Eichmann. According to Rafi Eitan, the Mossad knew Mengele was living in Buenos Aires at the time of Eichmann's capture. They decided to focus on Eichmann because he was deemed more of an important target, and they feared an attempt to nab Mengele would threaten the mission to get Eichmann. Zvi Aharoni, one of the agents who had been involved in the Eichmann capture, was placed in charge of a team of agents tasked with finding Mengele. Aharoni and his team followed Gerhardt to a rural area near Sao Paulo, where they identified a European man whom they believed to be Mengele. This potential breakthrough was reported to Harel, but the logistics of staging a capture, the budgetary constraints of the search operation, and the priority of focusing on Israel's deteriorating relationship with Egypt led the Mossad chief to call off the manhunt in 1962. In 2016, Brazil's University of Sao Paulo Medical School secured permission to use the bones of Nazi Germany's dreaded Angel of Death, Josef Mengele, in forensic medicine courses. Mengele's skeletal remains became a tool to teach students how to study bones and match their physical condition with documented information about the person. It was a strangely antiseptic epilogue to a story whose horror defies description. Mengele was a breed of monster all his own, a doctor who opted not to heal the sick, but instead conducted torturous and often fatal experiments on Jews at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Rolf Mengele, Josef Mengele's son, went to visit his father, who he had never met. At that time, Rolf Mengele hoped that his father would be contrite about what he had done at Auschwitz, and he was wrong. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode of True Crime Man's Dark Imagination, and if you liked us, please subscribe, hit the bell so you've been notified of future episodes. Also, we're on Facebook, Twitter, BitChute, Rumble.com, and we also have a new account with buymeacoffee.com, which I'll leave the link below. Until next time.